He aha, te mea nui ki tēnei ao. He tangata, he tangata, he tangata. What is the most important thing in the world? It is people. It is people. It is people. Community, 3 times people. Tihe mauri ora. It is the breath of activated life. He mihi aroha kia koutou katoa. Loving greetings to you all. Ki te atua, mātua. Ki te ihu karaete, ki te wairua tapu. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. To the Trinity, the heavenly beings, I give greetings te whare e tūnei, tēnā koe, to this house of learning today. Greetings. E ngā rangatira, me ngā kaikorero, tēnā koutou, kia ora koutou. Greetings to the speakers that have been, with my thanks, and to the distinguished guests among us. E ngā iwi hui nei, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. To all who are gathered here, once again, 3 times greetings. E taha o tōku pāpa. This is my lineage by my father. Ko ihu karaiti, ko te tama o te atua, a mātou ariki nui. Our paramount chief is Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Ko takitimu, te waka. Tribal canoe is the takitimu. Ko te waka o kupe. Right? Ko te waka o kupe me te tanewha tuhirangi o Aorangi ngā monga. These are my mountains in the south, Wairarapa, the waka of kupe upturned there following the tanewha tuhirangi as they navigated towards Aotearoa. Ko Rumahanga, te awa, ko Ngati Kahungunu ki Wairarapa, ko Ngati Porou, ko Kai Tahu o ko iwi. So my tribes basically are the whole east coast of New Zealand and the South Island. Ko Ngati Rakai Whakairi, toko hapu. My family grouping, my sub-tribe, means to lift up an adornment, the Rakai Whakairi. Ko Kohunui toko marae, at the base of the mountain at the back there. Ko Matenga ahau. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, katoa. And so, greetings to you all. I am Matenga. Thank you for your warm welcome. I'm Māori by my father's line, as I said, whose father, my paternal grandfather, had no Pākehā heritage. But I was raised in the Pākehā home of my mother and my stepfather and educated as a Pākehā under my stepfather's surname for a good part of my life, and I held that surname for the first part of my life. That I was Pākehā went without question, largely because of my non-summer skin tone and my faux surname. That I am instinctively Māori has been long a source of confusion for both me and the Pākehā colleagues that I worked with, trying to understand who I am and where I'm coming from. But I've come to embrace my hybridity, and that's a specific reference to Homi Baba, who was mentioned earlier before in his development of that third space, hybrid space. I've been a leader of missions organisations based out of Aotearoa, New Zealand for the past 19 years, carrying responsibilities here and also participating in leadership involvement in multicultural contexts overseas. I'm currently the Executive Officer of Missions Interlink New Zealand, the Industry Association of Mission Organisations here in New Zealand. Adjunct to that, I also serve as the Secretary of the International Council of Interserve, another mission organisation, a global mission organisation that works particularly in Asia and the Arab world. And I also serve as one of 4 associate directors on the World Evangelical Alliance Mission Commission. Try to say that in one breath. But in this session, I want to pull back the curtain on our lived realities. Have a look at some of the a priori, or the base assumptions that we make a lot of our decisions on. Those base assumptions inform our ethics, because our unconscious or our hidden biases will always determine how we understand, how we interpret or process what we experience, as well as influence the consequences or the outcomes of that interpreted perception. In other words, roots will always determine fruit. Viticulturalists will understand this, and here I'm nodding to Pete. It was great that grapes in the production of wine is a great example of roots determining the fruit. You can't have champagne because it has to be grown in the Champagne area. Forgive my ignorance. So say it with me. Our roots will always determine fruit. Okay, let's just try to bed that in a little bit, shall we? So I want to look today at two domains. Now, for some of you during this session, you might feel a little bit like Alice hurtling down the rabbit hole. And all I can hope for is by the end of it, you feel something of a soft landing, because it's going to get a little strange. But influenced by my own life journey, my doctoral work led me to consider the values differences between individualist and collectivist episteme. That's just a fancy word for episteme, knowledge systems, episteme, epistemology, episteme, ways of knowing. It's kind of like a worldview, but I've moved on from that worldview understanding, finding it far too rigid. I then began to equate individualist with industrial and collectivist with indigenous. So they're interchangeable terms. Episteme are knowledge domains rather than geographic domains. So we're not talking about geographies here, which allows for indigenous to emerge and located within the so-called Western Hemisphere, and industrials to emerge in the so-called Eastern and Southern geographies. Okay, so it's not limited to where they live. So for me, there really are just two people in the world. Simplifies my life no end, but as Pete was saying, it's far more complex than that. But we'll deal with these two. So the subjects of fair trade and other justice causes are most likely to identify as collectivist, or as I prefer, indigenous. Now, setting up two sweeping domains might seem overly binary, and to some degree industrial and indigenous are simplified groupings. But they're not reductionist categories, even though they might seem like it. There's a great deal of complexity to them, and we can't do justice to that in this session. It's just simply not possible. But suffice it to say, organizational and cross-cultural psychologists tend to agree that the individualist and the collectivist values dimension, okay, explains much about the cultural ideals that are very much in conflict today, and that's the heart. Like Barbara, my passion in my doctorate was to try and find areas of overlap and harmony, like Barbara. Who am I kidding? Okay, so there's a glimpse of my foundation. Some of my a priori assumptions, my base assumptions. If you need to probe my influences deeper, I'm a student of postmodern and post-colonial philosophy. So Linda Tuhiwai-Smith was a big informant in my research. My research was kaupapa Māori-based. And these inform an interpretive lens that helps me understand interpersonal and intercultural dynamics. Okay, where different groups of people with differences, they want to work together for some reason. So in this presentation, I'll focus on amplifying an indigenous episteme. Remember, the indigenous knowledge systems domain, or an ecosystem. And I'll relate that to the industrial episteme. But I want to emphasize that my objective is to counterpoint them, not to set up the industrial in opposition. Okay, so one of my rules for life, no reference to Jordan Peterson here, is this: never diminish the dignity of another. So I'm not trying to do that, neither am I trying to set up a straw man or woman to easily defeat. I'm merely pointing out the gaps in the industrial episteme where Indigenous voices can complement, can rise up, can be amplified. We heard yesterday that word amplification. My objective is always harmonization, not denigration. So there's some ground rules. So everything else has to be based on that. So right now, we've established all that. Let's talk about reality. Reality. It's an interesting concept. It's probably more appropriate to speak about realities, plural, because once you're exposed to plural realities, everything changes. The whole world suddenly becomes relative. There's really no single reality, only interpreted experiences of reality that is shared by groups. And each group, however you define the group, has a different understanding of what their reality actually is and means. And it's all because, I argue, the roots differ. So sure, there's a significant enough overlap for us to interact, but below the surface, there are at times some subtle and some quite significant differences. If there's one thing common to all humanity, it's our propensity to corrupt the ideal. So bear that in mind. Even good roots can produce bad fruit in the wrong environment. So nevertheless, in order to show how industrials and Indigenous can misunderstand each other in intercultural relationships, I'll deal with the subject matter in a rather idealized and generalized terms, and this is going to absolutely annoy the detail-oriented, fact-based people in our audience. But I will continue. In the industrial domain, the ground is very solid. It's material, it's physical, it's scientifically provable, it's mechanistic, separated, divisible, and freely manipulatable. Material is there for the taking, and whatever is there is viewed for its economic worth. Industrials call that capital, and in order to use it, you must have some degree of ownership over it, whether by title deed, however that title is obtained, or by contracted permission. The objective is acquisition, because economic wealth is power. In the Indigenous domain, the ground is very fluid. It is spiritual, it's traditional, it's volatile, it's interconnected, holistic, innate, and visceral. It is vital and intimately relational. Seen and unseen reality is there to be respected and nurtured with benefits and responsibilities shared communally. And of course, here I'm speaking very generally of two broad sets of base assumptions, two types of people in the broadest sense of the grouping. These are important to ethics because the roots will always determine the fruit. We cannot automatically assume a shared understanding of what ethics are. That's my main contention this morning, let alone trade ethics. The whole fair trade industry is largely built on a very particular set of ethical assumptions that they've developed in the industrial world over a couple of centuries of Euro-colonial philosophizing that increasingly pushed the spiritual out of the picture. And this spirituality is so core to the Indigenous reality. And the industrials have basically pushed it into the realm of fantasy. So if you remove the spiritual dimension from the picture, your ethics and your morality will take shape accordingly. So here, for the most part, social justice is devoid of spirituality. And I know a lot of you will argue against that, but in terms of the ethic and the roots of the initiative, it is largely devoid of spirituality. And it resorts to utility as the highest good. So utility, what's utility? It is determined by how useful or beneficial something is. So we can immediately see how utility becomes a relative term. Because for a hard-nosed capitalist, as we heard yesterday from Krishna, utility is marked by the largest profit margins and the most net income generated regardless of the human cost. If their children go without food, that's not our problem, so long as they buy our goods. For the more socially concerned, the utility is marked or determined by how much something will be of benefit to the most people in society. But who's the determiner of what benefit is and what benefit means? Those in power. Yeah? That's who. So this is not unique to industrials. It happens also among the Indigenous. But let's apply utility to the official fair trade systems for a moment. We've already dabbled in this area, and this is not at all, again, to denigrate the fair trade systems, but let's look at the logic of utility as a core root and see where that takes us in this system. So those with control over the certification process, the regulators, have become the external determiners of what well-being should look like to another group. I'm not saying fair trade aspirations are wrong, as I said, but when the certifiers focus solely on their perspective of economic, environmental, and social good, it can too easily become imperialistic. So a one-size-fits-all industrial approach is imposed, and it will inevitably disadvantage those whose circumstances and values don't fit. Everywhere there's a marginalised. So furthermore, the more economically valuable this fair trade concept becomes, the more likely more hands will extract profit from the processes that maintain the systems. So extra levels of management and compliance, we've already heard about the compliance controls, and then the producer cooperation is forced under duress because these large collectives start to put pressure on, and that leads way to corruption and yada, yada, yada. All of which leaves the producers ultimately bearing the cost, and particularly the smallest producers who can't access this. Thank you, Michaela, for pointing that out. All of which leaves these producers vulnerable. And the success of fair trade and the means to its success could actually too easily undermine its reason for being. So there's some dangers if you take things to their logical conclusions without some checks and balances and without outside influences. So global trade is predicated on an ethic of economic growth as the highest good. We would argue that shouldn't be the case, as was argued yesterday, but that's the reality we live in globally. Daniel Bell, writing in his 1972 article, The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism, he observed this: economic growth has become the secular religion of advancing industrial societies. And furthermore, I might add that economic growth for others, or seeking economic growth for others, in more indigenously inclined societies, has become the very definition of altruism in this religion. It is what energizes an industrial humanitarian mission to do material good in the world. Now, that's not a bad thing. By economic growth, we generally mean a rising standard of living. From increasing affluence, then you have more power, more choices possible. With more choice, more independence, with greater tolerance, increasing individualism. In other words, a shift or a drift towards the assumptions of the industrial episteme, which delights the industrials no end. They're becoming more like us. Colonizers used to call that civilization. It seems great at a superficial level, but we have to go deeper. And from the standpoint of the industrial, they see it as not a problem. But the values clash with many of the priorities of the Indigenous. And we need to remain aware of that. The morality that emerges from these so-called freedoms that economic growth brings is not necessarily wrong. I have to keep reiterating that. But it is incomplete. And we're experiencing in industrial world nations some of the costs that this is coming at. A cost to the environment, to relationships, to our identities, to the very fabric of our societies. And in many ways, the soul is missing from the economic growth mission. You probably didn't notice, but every single one of the global sustainability goals, or the donut economic categories that were presented yesterday morning, are entirely material. There was no non-material aspect to that. And for Indigenous, that can be very devaluing. And so I want to move towards this, one of the missing pieces, but a missing piece that is significant. Remember what I was saying? Roots will always determine the fruit. Yep, you got it almost there. If you are part of the industrial domain, as we most are, and to some degree, and your roots only assume a material reality, you will likely treat things with utility towards economic growth or a more existential outcome like pleasure or individual pleasure, which economic growth then becomes a means to an end. However, if you are innately Indigenous and your roots dive deeply into a spiritual reality, I suggest you'll treat things far more relationally, and quite different ethic emerges from those deeper roots. While the former is often considered more rational, the industrial domain is considered more rational, I think this is a baseless and actually an arrogant assumption of rationalism. For the Indigenous, spirituality is completely rational, and it comes with its own powerful logic. It's a different reality, but it's no less valid. And the industrial domain has, thank God, lost its moral authority as the validator of reality around the globe today. It's gone. I'm trying to reclaim it, but it's gone. So, like the iceberg, with most of its mass below the surface, the rationality of the Indigenous has very deep roots, and what is seen on the surface by industrialized sort of surface dwellers, if you will, with the shallower roots in this instance, is easily misinterpreted. So they only see what's going on above the waterline. If you have any desire at all of undertaking truly ethical trade with people from collectivist societies, you cannot afford to ignore what's below the surface of their Indigenous reality or realities. You may never fully understand it, but you cannot afford to just pay lip service to their beliefs with a condescending, "Oh, ain't that quaint?" Yeah? To start with, you need to learn to appreciate and to some degree accept the concept of life force. Are we there yet down that rabbit hole? Okay, every Indigenous culture is familiar with the life force that animates all material things. It's not the stuff of fantasy. It is the very core of Indigenous reality. It's usually quite high in our consciousness, actually, and part of our real-world perception, this otherworldliness. The concept of life force is described in different contexts in many ways, like chi under the Chinese, ki, Japanese, prana, Hindu, vijnana, Buddhist, ruach, or spirit, Judeo-Christian, baraka is a more Muslim understanding, ntu from the Bantu, manito from the Algonquian, ni from the Lakota, nilch from the Navajo, bioplasmic energy from Euro-Russian, mana from Melanesia, or for New Zealand Māori, we call it Maori. So if you have seen the movie Avatar, you will have a reasonable appreciation of the life force connectedness that Indigenous people innately feel with creation and with one another. There are varying degrees of awareness of this, of course, but it's the source of the values that the Indigenous would strongly adhere to and hold in common. And these roots determine very different, fruit. Yep. So oddly, in my investigations and through my doctoral research, I found that only those within the industrial episteme or knowledge domain disregard life force. And this refusal to acknowledge life force as part of our lived reality is a byproduct of industrial rationalism, where the 19th century and early 20th century evolutionary biologists and anthropologists ranked the life force believers at the bottom of the scale and enlightened rationalism at the top of the scale, and it was a completely constructed, convoluted system where they were at the top of the food chain. How convenient. So they called it animism. By and large, this whole grouping of life force believers is an animistic belief. There is no such thing as animism, let me be clear. Animism does not exist. It's a construct. It's just a way of describing other people's reality from a power position of colonialist evolutionary biology. So it's a colonizing construct. If you've read any post-colonial theory, in particular Ani Mikairi or Linda Tuhiwai Smith, talk about colonizing constructs. It's one of those. And it continues to negatively influence Western thought. A belief in the spiritual realm and life force, it's the taproot of indigenously informed ethics. The energy flow in all of creation is viewed with deep reverence and respect by most, not all, Indigenous peoples. There's therefore no disconnect between the material and the spiritual, this Cartesian dualism that developed in Western thought, separating the subject from the object. It's irrelevant for Indigenous. It's all subjective. Everything is personal. Our interactions with the world are not mechanical, they are relational, with wide-ranging effects, and nothing is exempt. So when you talk about transformation, you have to appreciate that transformation has spiritual dimensions. So let's move into kaupapa Māori as in just one example here. So here's how life force flows into reality for Māori, at least as I currently understand it. I have to caveat this. It should be noted that I'm speaking for myself, not Māori in general. Different iwi have different kaupapa. And even though I believe this will be resonant with most, some Māori will inevitably disagree with me and they'll pull me up on it at some point and I will learn because we're forever students. But we're now diving below the surface of the iceberg of one Indigenous perspective of reality. But in my experience, the concepts are resonant with other Indigenous peoples, a lot of others. So here we go. Māori is the life force essence of all things that emanates from the Creator into all of creation. Māori ora, as this declaration proclaims, Tihe Māori ora, it's Māori that has been activated. It's been given life. It animates everything, enlivens everything that has being in the world, all of creation. Now, Ho is the essential being that is activated. So for a human, Ho is our personal power, our will, our volition, our ability to do and activate and to use. Wairua, you've heard probably more familiar with, is spirit. On the other hand, it brings a different dimension. Māori is the temporal and the terrestrial. So it's the here and the now. It ceases to flow when the being ceases to live. Wairua is the eternal aspect of being and remains connected to the unseen, to the spiritual realm, both terrestrial and celestial, being here and over there, wherever over there is. It's the aspect of our human being that enables us to commune with spiritual beings, for good or for ill. Now, mana is what you see when all of these things have been activated and are at work in a person's life. It's our charisma. In a spiritual sense, traditional spiritual sense of the word, it's our divine grace. Yeah? So for Māori, and no doubt many other Indigenous people, a person's mana is recognized by their community and it's ascribed to the person by the community. You can't claim mana for yourself. You can do things that affect the community, lose mana. Yeah? You can do things for the community and you can gain mana. And the more mana you are recognized for, the higher status you have in the community. And the greater responsibility then you have to bear for the community's well-being. So mana is social currency. It is more important economically in an Indigenous system than cash. Mana is the only wealth that you truly have. simply translating mana as honour or respect does it no justice. It does a disservice to the concept. If a person is recognizing as having great mana, it's because their life force, their talent, spiritual giftedness, it's all being recognized and endorsed by the community. Furthermore, the benefits of having mana make you want to defend your mana to ensure it's not unfairly tainted. If it is, then you're compelled to seek retribution as if somebody or something dear had been stolen from you. You want to get it back, and traditionally, your very life could depend on your mana being restored, and hence we have the system of utu in its negative sense. Utu is also a positive, by the way, of reciprocation. It's a whole way of reciprocated life. So when translated into Western concepts, industrials know that these psychological and personality dimensions exist. It's part of their lived experience. But shallow roots do not enable them to explain why they exist, let alone, or they actually won't commit to explaining why they exist, let alone identify the source of that being or our being. So this deficit is being increasingly felt in the industrial domain. So through the so-called New Age movements, through expressions of spirituality and mysticism, and there's a yearning for what the philosopher Charles Taylor calls re-enchantment. It's a desire to reclaim the spiritual sense of the world. The increase of supernatural and superhero fantasy in our entertainment industry from the 80s reflects a shift away from the Enlightenment rationalism that disenchanted reality. And fair warning here, hear me on this, dabbling in the spiritual realm without the checks and balances of religious disciplines and relationships leads to very real danger. Yeah, but that's beyond the scope of this presentation. So that said, the default industrial perspective is still very much limited to the physical realm, with little understanding or appreciation of the unseen influences of the spiritual realm. It's most common to see industrial visitors to Indigenous contexts treat spiritually informed practices with some condescension, or at least some confusion. They might genuinely feel moved by the Indigenous passionate belief, but will most often write off the practices as needless superstition. We see that here with Pākehā rolling their eyes and checking their watches whenever tikanga Māori comes into the play. It's all about time and it's insignificant to them. But rather, rarely can an industrial thinker move beyond the position of an observer to experience the world of the Indigenous as a participant. You may think this unnecessary for trade, but until you are able to accept and to some degree navigate spiritual realities, you'll never be able to fully connect with and understand your Indigenous colleagues, nor appreciate their expectations from your relationship, which reach far beyond business metrics, as I'll just show briefly to wind up here and skip over the moral issues of this, because Indigenous ethics draws from a transcendent morality, not a terrestrially based morality. And relationships are the highest ideal. So in order to, whatever informs the ethic of the Indigenous, it has to preserve and enhance and maintain relationships. Fidelity is the most important thing in an Indigenous relationship. Faithfulness is core to all Indigenous. And to break that, it's a spiritual connection. Whenever you develop a relationship, it's spiritually informed. And to break that is akin to either a divorce or a death. It's felt viscerally, it's grievous for a relationship to end. So you can imagine an industrial coming in with a contractual understanding of a relationship. So we all agreed, yes, here are the terms. Yes, once it's finished, the objective's done. Yes, we go our separate ways. No. It's often not thought about or spoken about, but the Indigenous expects continual involvement over a long time. And I'm thrilled to hear here a lot of the businesses here are expecting long-term relationship, because that's the expectation of the Indigenous. And here we are, transcendent picture. fidelity picture, and now we're on track. So these agreements can get misunderstood and misinterpreted. And the same thing's happening with the Treaty of Waitangi right now. The Pākehā are treated like a contract. The Māori treat it as it was intended to be, as a covenant. And the Māori say when a covenant, it's a spiritual thing. When a spiritual covenant is broken, there are very real-world effects. And John Key and others have said once the treaty stuff's finished, we're going to put it away. Thank you very much. That was a lovely part of our history. No. The covenant paradigm says, no. The Māori want to put it into a constitution because this is an ongoing agreement. Relationships create influence. They create synergy. It's the intertwining of life forces that create power. And if you rip that apart, then you are doing a disservice to the Indigenous people. And I do want to say this, that patronists can actually be healthy. Indigenous are set up as patron societies. If you're a chief, you are responsible for caring for your whole community. And when you enter a relationship, if you have the power, then you're perceived to be a patron. And what the Westerners, the industrials, don't understand is there are obligations on that relationship as a patron. And you need to appreciate these differences. This is a great example. Sir Edmund Hillary. I mean, there's nothing really, there are positives and negatives. But Hillary's relationship with the Sherpa was long-term. He recognized it as something of a patron. He was in their hands. His life was in their hands when he was over there. And when he was back here, their concerns became his concerns, and he helped them. It was a reciprocal arrangement, and reciprocation neutralizes the power imbalance, so long as you perceive value in what they are offering you. So in conclusion, I hope this brief glimpse into these two, very brief glimpses, into these two epistemic or knowledge domains proves helpful for you who are pursuing ethical trade relationships with overseas suppliers, as well as people who are participating in that whole supply chain, because this has to inform your ethic. If you want to promote a high and holistic ethical standard, you're taking on a significant responsibility. All of you are. It's very difficult to maintain at scale. That's the problem. May your ideals be fueled with much wisdom and great sensitivity, and may your rewards be eternal, really. For we who participate as consumers, our relationship with the providers of the products that we use and consume, it's also a vital one. We've heard it already. The Fair Trade Lobby has taught us that we customers have power to demand these ethical standards. Go beyond just the material. Look at the relationships there. We have a responsibility to manage these relationships as well, both the relationships with who we're purchasing from and the relationships that flow on from that. They may not be as spiritually connected as the interpersonal relationships that are engaged or experienced by frontline trainers or entrepreneurs. Or maybe they are spiritual. There's some food for thought. But they are more than merely transactional. So more power to us there. For all of us, as we go about our daily lives, may we take care to nurture all relationships, treat them as sacred, not just in our personal lives, but in our professional lives also. And I do pray, sincerely pray, that this session will help extend your roots a little deeper and your mind a bit broader toward the vital life force that most of the world believes sustains us. As you do so in all your relationships, may you experience the Creator there in such a way that you are forever changed, especially as you interact with others who have a different experience of the Creator. Mā te atua e manaaki ki a koutou. The goodness of God be to you all. And remember, your roots will always determine the fruit. So as the waiata of my wānanga whanauna canon Wiriumu, Te Tahu Huata of Ngati Kahungunu, he encourages us to let's make an effort to align ourselves together in unified fashion, all seeking mutual enlightenment in love. And you will all know the song, but I give you my personal more tia, or my personal interpretation of this well-known child singing song. Tu te mana iwi, tato e, tu te mana iwi, tato e, hai te mara matanga, ki te aroha ngā iwi, kia tapatahi, kia kotahira, kia kalatita, kia kotahira, tato e, tato e, tato e, hio, hi. Ki tau te araha, no kia mātou mai ti ranga mārie. Kia ora tātou.